Welcome, everybody. You're in Lagoon K. Our next talk is the remote Butler did it with Tal Be'eri and Chaim Hoch. I've got a couple of quick announcements. If you haven't already, stop by the business hall on the first level in Bayside AB. A lot of great vendors in there. They'd love to talk to you. The Black Hat Arsenal is on the third level. If you haven't made it up there, it's just past the escalators. A lot of neat stuff in the arsenal, and there'll also be a reception up there at 1700. And then if you haven't picked up your merchandise in the Black Hat Swag store or the bookstore, that's also, today's the last day for that. That's on level 2 here as well. If you haven't put your phone on silent yet, please do that so you don't interrupt the presentation. And I'll leave it to these guys.
So thank you for the introduction. Our talk today, the remote Butler did it. I'm Tal Be'eri. I lead the research team of the Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics product, and Chaim Hoch, researcher in the team. And let's start with a quick warm-up question. So what is missing in this painting? Anyone knows? Kind of obvious. Well, obviously they didn't take the laptop to breakfast, and which is quite unfortunate because an evil maid may enter to their hotel room and get access to their computer. But you say, this is a bunch of, they look tech savvy, they probably have passwords for their computers, and they understand the threat, and they may also have a hardware encrypted hard drive, so the attacker cannot simply just take the hard drive and mount it in another computer. So they're good. They can enjoy their breakfast, right? Or aren't they? And let's see this video and we will understand it afterwards. And this is an attack demonstrated by Ian Hacken last year on Black Hat Europe. And let's see. So let's see the video. Just a sec. Okay, so we have here some device, a Raspberry Pi, we don't know what it is. And there's a laptop here. Ian will show he doesn't know the password. You enter A and get password is wrong. And then Ian connects that device into the network interface, enters A again. But now it's prompted to change his password. So it changes from A to B. Password is being changed. Disconnects the device. Press enter and wait, and he's in. So very clever attack. And I think Ian is here in the crowd. So hi, Ian. So I think he deserves a round of applause for that attack. Thank you, Ian. And so what are we going to talk today? Chaim will start by analyzing the evil maid attack and telling you all the technical details behind it. Also, there are some general lessons here about the logon mechanics in Windows. How does it behave in the presence of domain controller with Kerberos, the cache credential mechanism for when a domain controller is not accessible, and the change password mechanism. Then we will present our new contribution, the remote malicious Butler attack, which even made is very cool, but it requires physical access of the attacker. As we've seen, it would be so much more useful for the attacker if they can launch that attack from network access and not physical access. And we will show this is possible and how it fits into attacker's cyber kill chain model. And hopefully, if the demo gods permit, we'll do a live demo of it. And we would conclude with some solutions to both our attack and the original even made attack of patching, hardening, and defense in depth. So with that, I pass to Chaim.
Thank you very much. You here? Okay, so we'll be talking about the evil maid attack. The term was first coined by Joanna Rutkowska in 2009. The same scenario that Tal talked about. You leave your laptop in a hotel room and go to breakfast, and meanwhile an evil maid enters your room, has physical access to your computer, and can do whatever she wants. So there are two doors to the machine. The first one is the password. If there's no password, you can just log on and do whatever you want. And backdoor, the hard drive. If the hard drive is not encrypted, you can just mount it on another computer, copy all the data, and you're good. So the original attack was getting the encrypted key for the encrypted hard drive and decrypting it. And Ian's attack was to bypass the password. It was a attack that was presented last year in Black Hat Europe, and we'll go into that attack. So to understand the attack, we have to understand Kerberos and Windows authentication. All right, so first of all, thanks to Benjamin Dilpe for the graphics. And now we'll talk about Kerberos. All right, so Kerberos is a network protocol which does authentication and authorization in a network. A domain controller is the main source of trust in the Kerberos environment. There are three different types of entities: the domain controller, users, and servers or services. Each one has its own set of keys. We'll discuss the user keys and the server keys. So how does it work? A user, when he wants to log on, he enters his password into the computer. This password is then hashed into different keys from different encryption suites, such as AES, RC4, and so forth. He then requests something that's called TGT from the domain controller. This is done by encrypting a timestamp with his key. The DC then gets the request, which is called AS request, and tries to decrypt it with the keys. The DC has the keys for all the users and for all the servers. So if the key is correct, he will successfully decrypt the timestamp, and if it matches, then he will give the TGT, the ticket granting ticket, to the user. Whenever a user wants to gain access to a service in the network, he'll pass this TGT to the domain controller and ask for a specific service. The domain controller will then create a service ticket to that requested service, which will be encrypted with the service's key. He will then give that service key to the user. Since it's encrypted with the service's key, the user will not be able to manipulate it, and the user will pass this service key to the server, who will then be able to decrypt it and give the service to the user. All right, so domain logon is a special case of a resource access. In our case, the resource is the target computer, and the service name is host/the machine name. As you can see on the right, there is an AS request from our auto server, and the service that it looks for wants is host and our auto server. So it's the same name. Since we said that every service has its own ticket, this means that our host computer, the computer itself, has a password as well. So this is called the machine key or the computer account key, computer password. They're all the same. Once the user has the computer key, or the computer key is validated, this creates something that we call a domain trust relationship. This means that the domain controller knows the correct computer key. All right. So we've talked about authentication in the network environment. What happens if a user takes his computer home and isn't connected anymore to a domain controller? So in this case, we have something that's called cache credentials. When a user initially logs on, his password is hashed into a cache credential entry. This cache credential entry is stored in the registry on the hard drive, and is stored in a format that's called MS-cache2, which you can see here is a PBKDF2 of the password and the user. Their iteration number is 10,240. And this is stored in the registry. Now, this is hard to crack, also because of the number of iterations and the salt of the user, and it isn't reusable. You can't steal these cache credentials, transfer them to another computer, and use them. So whenever a user logs on, and he's not in a domain environment, the cache credential is calculated and is checked against what is stored in the registry. If they are matched, then the user gains access to the computer. The last thing that we'll need to know about is what happens when a password is expired. So if a user is connected to a domain controller and he tries to gain access to the machine by asking for an AS request, if the password has been expired, the domain controller will then reply with a Kerberos error of Kerb 5KDC error key expired. You can see it right here on the right. And will then prompt the change password process. The user will enter the old password, which will then be used to transfer the new password to the domain controller. Once the new password has gone to the domain controller, he will update his keys and will let the user log on. In this process, the new password will be updated in the cache credentials entry, which we saw last slide. Something interesting to note about this procedure, and it's actually crucial for our attack, is that this process does not require the computer account key. It only requires the user key. All right, so we've learned about network authentication and local authentication. So what an attacker might do. He can take set up his own DC, a rogue DC, with the same domain name. This domain can be easily found by looking at the UI of the computer. On the DC, he'll create a new user account, whatever account he wants, and set attacker chosen password. He'll then physically connect the computer, the rogue DC to the computer, and the attacker will then log in using the rogue password. But this doesn't work. This doesn't work because there isn't a trust relationship between the new rogue DC and the victim machine. Recall that accessing a host is actually accessing a service in Kerberos. In our case, the target machine. Since the rogue DC does not have the computer account key, the ticket cannot be validated, and that's the reason that this naive attack does not work. So Ian's attack is sort of a revision of this attack. What he did was set up a new rogue DC. The password is chosen by the attacker, but the user is the same user as the user that is currently logged on. The password for this user is then marked as expired. The attacker will then connect the DC to the rogue DC to the target machine and enter his chosen password. Since the password is marked as expired on the DC, this will prompt the password change, which will then lead to the cache credentials being poisoned with the new password. The attacker will then disconnect the DC, and now he'll enter his new attacker-chosen password, which will then be calculated to a cache credential entry, checked against the cache credential entry that was poisoned, and he'll gain access to the computer. Wait. This isn't. All right, so now let's look at the video again, now that we know what's going on. So the Raspberry Pi is our rogue DC, and we have the target computer on the left. And now Ian will try to log on, but it doesn't work. Now the rogue DC already has the user in it, and it's marked as password expired. So he'll enter his chosen password, and will be prompted for a change password. Choose a different password and change it. Cache credentials have been poisoned. We'll now disconnect the rogue DC and log on with the new password, which will then be checked against the cache credentials and log on. All right, so to sum up, this is our evil maid. This is the target computer and the real DC. Now, now the target machine has been disconnected from the real DC and connected to a rogue DC. The attacker changes the password on the computer and gains control of the computer. All right. So the main issue here is that the cache credentials get poisoned without trust being validated. So the fix was to ask for a ticket to the computer. Fix didn't work quite right, and only a ticket was asked. Another fix for that was to actually validate the trust, and this was found by Nabil Ahmed and Tom Gillis. Those couple then looked at other different parts of Kerberos that don't involve the computer trust, or actually they look for processes, not just Kerberos, that don't involve computer trust. And they found that group policy, the user group policy, doesn't check for computer trust, doesn't require the computer account key. Now, group policy has system privileges. So what they did was, using the exact same techniques as before, spawn a shell as a task, scheduled task on the attacked machine. And as I said, since group policy runs a system, they have had a shell and system privileges on that attacked machine, as you can see on the right. All right, so now I'm gonna hand it over to Tal to talk about our attack.
Thank you, Chaim. Now we're ready for the new stuff, for the remote Butler attack when the evil met the cyber kill chain. So, very cool attack, evil made, yet it requires physical access, and the harsh reality for the attackers, they often don't have physical access, but what they do often have is network access. And if we are able to take the evil made attack and transform it into the remote Butler attack, which is the same, just don't require physical access, can be launched from afar from the network, it would be very beneficial for them. And let's take a look of what advanced attackers are doing on their victims' network. So we had divided it into three main phases. The initial phase of just getting in, the attacker just getting into the network. So it starts with the network infiltration, hacking an arbitrary machine that the attacker are able to get into, and then they want to get a single set of domain credentials. Why? Because with domain credentials, they can do a lot of movement, which is big words for abusing the access that these credentials, domain credentials, enable, and use it to access other computers, harvest more credentials on this computer, and goes like that, so on and so forth, until they grab more and more credentials and finally get some of the highly privileged user credentials, the domain admin. When they have domain admin credentials, they basically have access to every machine in the domain. They can further abuse it to gain access to the domain controller and download using DC sync or functionality like that, all of the keys to all of the users in the domain. And now the attacker in the end of the second stage have all keys to all doors in the domain, but they are not winning yet because they still have to get into the data, and this is the final stage. So they make their way into the data. They have all the access they need, but they still need to find the data and exfiltrate it to their server, and then attackers win. And this is where this attack meets us, because in Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics, ATA, that's what we do. We research the attacker's kill chain, try to detect as many parts of it as we can. And this got us thinking. We saw Ian's talk and thought, whether the attackers that we research, advanced attackers that do network-based attacks, are they able to use it? And most specifically, the attacker's biggest motivation would be the initial stage, because in the initial stage, attacker has access to a non-domain joined machine, and they would like to jump into a machine that stores domain credentials. But how would they do that? So if they are able to use that even-made black magic to get into the domain machine, it would be great. So how does it happen that attacker has access to the network but don't have domain credential? So in many cases, attacker hacks some internet-facing yet non-domain joined machine, for example, exploiting a web server using some kind of web application vulnerability, SQL injection, or RFI, LFI, you name it, and gaining access to that web server using a web shell, but still this machine is not part of the domain. So this is just one opportunity for the attacker to have that kind of situation. And just to make sure and show you that it's not a theoretical attack, but it's a valid scenario, let's take a deeper look at the hacking team breach, which is not really interesting from technical point of view, but what is different about it is that the attacker had published a detailed account of his doing on the network, so we know what is done and we are able to learn from it. So the attacker infiltrated the network by using some zero-day vulnerability in a network device. Then they did internal reconnaissance, passively monitoring traffic of a nearby machine and also actively scanning the internal network, and found out a vulnerable network storage device. And that storage device, which required no authentication, also stored the images of a certain virtual machine, of domain machine, and the attacker was able to analyze the hard drive of these VMs and extract domain credential, and then really reached the goal of this initial phase and able to do lateral movement in the second phase. So it's time to pimp our exploit from the evil maid to the remote Butler. So on the original attack, we had logon, UI, view, and access that require physical access. We will translate it to RDP, remote desktop protocol access. The ROGDC was brought in with the Raspberry Pi. We will have it as the payload of the malware on the breach machine. We will replace, the replacement of the original DC with ROGDC was done with a physical network cable. We would have to use some routing manipulation, network manipulation for that. And there is an additional problem, which is not strictly technical, but in the evil maid, it could be that this is the final stage of the attack. The attacker is able to dump afterwards the computer. Maybe secrecy is not so important, but in our case, in the advanced attacker case, it's very important because this is just the beginning of the attacker's campaign. Even if this attack is successful by itself, yet it leads to discovery of the campaign, the attacker lose because it's very initial stage. They didn't get the data they wanted and they got discovered. So it's very important for advanced attacker to remain stealthy with this attack, and we'll discuss it. So let's get to the details. Attackers start by breaching a non-domain joined machine on the internal network, just as it happened in the hacking team case. Attacker installs the needed ROGDC functionality on the breach machine. It doesn't have to be a fully blown domain controller. It just needs to support certain functionalities, the change password and key-based authentication. For example, attacker may use Ian's Blue Box project on GitHub. Check this out. And then the attacker need to scan for potentially victims. So what are the attacker's potential victims? They need to have RDP access, and attackers can check for it using Nmap scan on the relevant port 3389. And also they need to find machines they see their traffic so they can manipulate it and answer queries to the DC on behalf of the DC with the ROGDC. So they scan the network actively and passively and find such target. It's also helpful to make sure that the user is not currently active on the machine, as accessing RDP concurrently with the user may cause one of the session not to succeed and kick the other user. So again, not something that the attacker wants, but they can so they can check for it from traffic or just wait till it's very late at night or very early in the morning. Okay, so attackers have everything. They did all the setup. It's time to attack. Attackers hijack the victim machine, traffic to the DC. This can be done. We've done it with our poisoning, our spoofing, which is Hackers 101, but there might be a lot of other ways to do it, using DNS poisoning, LLMNR, and BNS, or just answering before the original DC with no man in the middle, just men on the side. And if someone wants to explore it and tell me the results, I'll be happy to hear. And then once the attacker has connectivity with the rogue DC to their target machine, they connect via RDP to that machine, configure the rogue DC accordingly to the UI or based on the traffic, on the correct domain name, and also the username needed for the evil maid, perform the evil maid attack, trigger password change, and using that and causes the cache credential to be poisoned, then stop answering from the rogue DC, causing a local cache credential logon with the attacker control password. The attacker gets in, takes over. If needed, now the attacker can escalate to local administrator using the rogue group policy attack that Chaim had shown. Then the attacker is able to dump the domain credential from memory of the original user, and we'll talk about that because it's a little bit surprising. We changed the original user password. How come his keys are still in memory? And now the attacker can return whenever they want to this computer because they have already the domain credentials. And without having any RAT, any remote access tool, the attacker are able to return to that computer. And also they had achieved a domain credential, which was their goal for this stage. So let's talk about the attacker extracting keys from memory. And it appears that even this is the regular behavior of password change. When you change password, you can test it in your own environment using Mimikatz. The old password keys remains in LSASS memory, and I hope you can see that in the screenshot on the left-hand side. You can see that for the same session, there are two NTLM keys exist for the same session. One corresponds to the older password, which was ABC123ABC, and the second corresponds to the attacker's new password, which is B. Okay, now let's discuss cleanup, because we said it's very important for the attacker to remain stealthy. So for most cases, attackers don't have to do anything. They just reroute back the target computer into the original DC. And as we said, it happened very late at night. In the morning, when the user comes in, the user doesn't know that something had happened, so they would input their normal password. The DC, original DC, again, doesn't know something bad has happened, nothing changed there. So it sees that original password, compares it to the password that the DC has, and authenticate the user. And when so the authentication is successful, and the cache credential gets updated because the cache credential says, oh, this is a hash that is different than what I have in my cache credential store. So it updates the cache credential store, and everything goes back to normal. But it's not good enough for the attacker, because there is a possibility, maybe a remote possibility, that the user will come in the morning, and instead of logging in to his machine, they would take the machine to some meeting that they have, and they don't have a DC connectivity there, so cache credentials logon would be performed, and the user won't be able to access their computer because the cache credential was poisoned with the attacker control password that the user doesn't know, and then the user might go to IT and say, there's something wrong with my computer, and which might lead to the discovery of the attacker. So attacker needs to take care of it. And to take care of it, let's recall that cache credential, the only secret ingredient in the cache credential hash is the MD4 of the password. And let's recall that MD4 of the password is actually anti-hash. Wait a minute, anti-hash, we just extracted it from memory. The attacker just extracted it. So attackers have all the ingredients most importantly, the MD4 hash, which is the NTLM hash, but also the username, of course, which is not a secret. And they also don't need to code because this functionality is already present in the Mimikatz tool. So just input the NTLM hash and the username, and Mimikatz will take care of it and update the cache credential store for the attacker. So I think this is a good time to see that live. So Chaim, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you. Don't need this. All right, so let's do a demo. All right, so our scenario is that we have a victim machine, in our case, this VLab Win10, and it has a real DC, and we'll set up a rogue DC and an attacker. Our attacker will be a Kali Linux machine. Now, I just want to log in here and make sure that everything works. So this is the original password, ABC123 ABC, and he logs on, all right? So he locks the computer and goes home, for example. All right. So in our case, where's our machine? All right, so I hope you can see. This is the attacker. So the attacker will first scan for all RDP ports on the network. And he found one machine, this machine with an open RDP port, and he can remote desktop to it to see the username and the domain name. So in this situation, he has everything that he needs in order to set up a rogue DC. He needs the domain name and he needs the username to set up the user. So for this demonstration, we'll do the routing manipulation by enabling and disabling adapters because it demonstrates better what's going on. So this is our DC, and we'll perform the routing manipulation. We'll just disable this adapter and enable it on our rogue DC. So now all traffic is routed to the rogue DC. In our case, this DC is just a regular domain controller, but it can be something smaller. All right, so we'll create a new user. It's user 2 and user 2. And the password will be A, and must change password at next logon. All right. Now going back to our attacker. So we'll connect to the user with our password, and we're prompted to change the password. So we'll change it to B. And the password has been changed. And at this stage, we want to simulate the disconnection of the DC, or the stopping of all traffic. So we'll just disable the adapter, not this one, on the rogue DC, and perform the password change. Where is it? Okay. Now this takes a while because the machine will try and connect to a DC. It will time out. It will try again. It will time out. This might take a while. It's important to note that this vulnerability has been patched in the end of 2015. But up until the patch, it worked on all versions of Windows.
Maybe it's a good time to take some question if there are. While we're waiting, it will take a minute, but we try to keep it real and do a real demo. So if there are, oh yeah.
Can you explain, so MS16072 that just came out changed the way the policy processing happened, and changed the context in which user processing ran, and it seems related to this. Can you explain how it's related to this, in other words, why they changed the context?
Yeah, so
Meanwhile, we managed to log on. You want to answer the question?
let's take the question. So it really changed. Well, the root cause of all this problem is that the domain trust is not validated. it's not validated that the computer does not mutually authenticate that this is a real DC talking to it. And by changing the way that group policy is now done from the computer context and not from the user context, it requires the trust to be validated. So now the trust is validated and this attack no longer works. So great question. So let's proceed.
All right, so now the attacker have gained control on the machine. Now, just to demonstrate that the the original password doesn't work, I'm gonna log off and try and log on with the original password. All right, so I'm gonna log off and log on again. So recall that the original password was ABC123ABC. And this shouldn't work. So we'll have to wait a while.
So maybe it's time for another question.
Oh,
yeah,
wait.
Lucian.
So, and it didn't work.
Next
all right. So entering the attacker chosen one, which was B, logs on. All right. So the cache credentials have been poisoned and the user can't connect with his original password. Now, what we'll do is the attackers will grab the credentials. So we'll reconnect our DC, and I already opened a share there for, here it is, rogue DC share, which conveniently has Mimikatz on it. And we'll run it as administrator. So in the demo, the user is an administrator, but as we've seen before, we can just do privilege escalation to get to system. All right, so. All right, so now we'll grab the hashes. And this is our users. And as you can see, this is the new NTLM hash, and this is the old one. So we'll grab the old hash, just mark it. All right. And now we'll replace the cache credentials. We'll do the cleanup. So in order to do that, we have to have system privileges. All right. And now let's just take a look at the cache. All right. So this is our MS cache v2. And now we'll just enter our ingredients, which is the user and the NTLM, which we just grabbed. And the cache has been replaced. All right. So the attacker cleaned up. He has the user credentials. He'll delete Mimikatz and log off. And now I want to demonstrate the scenario where the user comes into the office and takes his laptop, but isn't connected to the domain controller. So we'll just disconnect our rogue DC. So now the machine is not connected to anything. Where is it? Here it is. And this is the user trying to enter his original password, not connected to any DC. Again, it will try to look for a DC, will time out, and will eventually go to the cache credentials, which we just cleaned up. And voila, we cleaned up. Now, just to show you that if we connect it to back to the domain controller, it still works. I'll enable the domain controller, enter the original password, and we're connected. And the final stage is that since we grabbed the hashes, we can now perform, for example, a pass the hash attack. So let's just copy this. And let's do who am I, user true running on VLab 1, and the attacker can do whatever he wants from here on. All right.
Wow, it's exciting for me to see it every time. And thank you, Chaim. And thank you for the demo gods for allowing all this to happen. Yeah, it's very stressful, having a live demo. And so I appreciate you, Chaim, for doing it. So let's sum up. So we had the evil-made attack, which required some physical access. The attacker steps up to the attacked computer, brings a ROG DC, connects it to the computer, triggers a change password, poisons the cache credential, and gets in. In the evil remote butler, the attacker penetrates the network, installs ROG DC on the breach machine, manipulate traffic so DC traffic comes to its machine, and then triggers change password, poison the cache credential, gets in, extract NTLM hashes, restores everything to be normal. So we had seen that this remote butler attack is very much relevant for the first phase of the attacker, initial phase, to go from network connectivity to domain credentials, but it's also relevant for the second stage. Now that the attacker has domain credentials, they are able to do further reconnaissance attack to find out where the privileged user reside, where the log on, and we realize that as a byproduct of our attack, well, the attacker can use RDP reconnaissance for that. Just RDP connect to any machine, to every machine, and see which users are currently logged on, specifically where are the admins logged on. So in fact, the whole cycle of the lateral movement can be realized just using a remote butler. For admin reconnaissance, the attacker might use RDP reconnaissance. For remote code execution, the remote butler is there. To escalate local privileges, ROG group policy update, and to compromise credential, Mimikatz from memory. And of course, it can be mix and match with existing lateral movement techniques. So let's talk about defense. So first of all, install patches. This is a partial list of man-in-the-middle related attacks and patches in Windows. Man-in-the-middle, DC, domain controller man-in-the-middle, not general man-in-the-middle attacks. So at least 6 patches, 3 related to evil-made, 2 are related to the Jazz bug, which is another man-in-the-middle attack against group policy. If you attended Sean Metcalf talk the other day, it talked about it, so you might want to see it afterwards in the video. And also the bedlock, the infamous bedlock, which is a man-in-the-middle attack against RPC. So patch, especially if you thought that maybe you thought evil-made is not so important to patch because it required physical access. No, it can be done also from a remote access. So if you haven't patched that, if you deprioritized it, go back home and patch. Let's talk about hardening. There are 2 protocols in this attack, RDP and Kerberos, and both can be hardened to mitigate this attack. So RDP hardening can be done with NLA, network level authentication, which really changes the order of things and move authentication up front. So a user needs to pay their authentication up front and prove that they are able to authenticate. And this way, the attack is mitigated because the attacker cannot prove they are able to access the machine because they can't. That's why they're doing the attack. And the Kerberos armoring. Kerberos armoring, it relates to the question, to the previous question from the crowd. The root cause of this problem is that someone forgot to check for domain trust, and Kerberos armoring bakes trust into Kerberos, and in fact everything, all the user authentication is now depends on the computer previous authentication. So specifically Kerberos errors get signed with the computer session key, so the attacker can no longer fake errors such as to trigger a Kerberos password change, because the attacker don't have the computer key and unable to properly sign it. And even if they were able to sign it, they would fail in the next phase because the Kerberos authentication to change the password would fail because it depends on knowing the computer key too. So if you can, please apply Kerberos armoring, and you can see in the screenshot on the bottom, there is highlighted the encrypted part in the Kerberos error under Kerberos armoring. And this is a feature that's available since Windows 8 Server 2012, and also backward compatible, so you can also work with it with Windows 7, and it doesn't break Windows 7, or at least allegedly. And finally, defense in depth. So this is kind of more philosophical advice, because you might say, okay, this is for this specific attack. You have all kind of patches and hardening. How I'm going to defend against all that in advance when I'm not aware of such attack? So we've seen that the Reva model for the attacker is the cyber kill chain. So it's kill, it's kind of scary, but it's chain. And chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if we, as defenders, deploy a solution that detects all the different steps, so even if the attacker is able to bypass our defenses and come up with new attack that we are not aware of, we will catch it on the other steps. So do that. So let's conclude. What was our new contribution? We'd seen Ian Hacken original attack, but made it fit to advanced attacker scenario by addressing access over RDP, ROGDC as a malware payload, ROGDC connection with routing manipulation, compromising domain credential with Mimikatz, and a stealthy cleanup to restore the cache credentials. Additional contribution that can be used outside of the context of the remote Butler is the RDP reconnaissance attack vector, and the defense of applying Kerberos armoring, which defeats also the original ROGDC even made attack. Takeaways. So local even made is very cool, but remote Butler is also cool, but very practical. ROGDC, as we've seen, there are many patches for that, are vast and relevant, so you should be afraid of it. And solutions are patching, hardening, defense in depth. And final slide, some thank yous to Ian Hacken for the inspiration and contribution to this work, Benjamin DP, Mimikatz author from Mimikatz, and also for a useful comment, and Tom Gillis, one of the researcher mentioned here, for he did a review on our talk too. To Microsoft ATA researchers that are not here today, Itai Grady and Tamar, which contributed to this research, and finally to our designer, talented designer Damor, with the nice infographics. So with that, questions? Yeah, please.
If the PC had BitLocker, this would foil your attack, right?
Well, no, because even the question was, would BitLocker help? And BitLocker does not help, and this was in fact the motivation for Ian's original attack, to bypass BitLockers, because you are able to log on. You're not taking the computer out of taking the hard drive outside of the computer and mounting it in another place. What would work is the boot. If the machine has a BitLocker password on before, Ian Hacken attack wouldn't work. But our attack would work because in most cases, computer remains online. Let's say this is a server and remains online. So it has only Windows log on to it and not a BitLocker log on to it. We are not restarting, we are not powering up and down the computer, so we won't be prompted for a BitLocker. So it doesn't help to our attack. Any more questions? Yes, please. So there's another comment, maybe refer to him to say the other mitigations. Any more questions? So thank you all for coming here today. We appreciate your time. Thank you.